Hello everyone, and welcome to my workshop. This is the first of 3 videos where I'm going to show myself building 3 N-scale kits. This is for a small portable layout that the Model Railroad Club I'm in is building to take on the road. And I picked 3 Craftsman kits from Mud Creek Models. This is their barn. Now I've only done a couple N-scale kits in the past, so let's see how these go. These are all the parts that come in the kit, and you get everything that you need to build the barn. I first started by separating the walls and the stripwood, and the first thing I did was I started distressing the wood on the siding, and I also used my Ponce wheel for adding nail holes. I knew I was going to use my Viterro barn stain, but I wanted to see what other stains went with it, so I did a test. Then I started cutting the stripwood to add my bracing to the walls. After I had glued the bracing in place, I glued my walls together, making sure they were at 90-degree angles. After I had 2 L's, then I glued them together into one building. Then I did the same with the little outbuilding that went alongside it. My next step was to apply the barn red stain all over the barn portion. Then I cut the corner posts that were going to go in both the barn and the outbuilding, and I glued them in place. On the barn, they were going to be stained a different color, and my outbuilding was completely stained a murky brown. Then where the corners came up, I used my sander to make sure that the entire wall was flush with the gable ends. By doing this, the roof sits flat. I do this on pretty much all the buildings that I build that have gable ends. And you can see I had to do the same thing to the small outbuilding. You can tell the roof wouldn't sit flat without doing this. But it's an easy step using an Ultimation sander. The next thing that I did was put together the little storage shed that sits alongside the barn. Then I put all of the pieces together to see how they'd end up once it was assembled. Then after spraying the window and door assembly with a gray primer, I used a chalky paint in parchment color, and I used a sponge to apply it to the windows and doors. Now I had decided that I wanted to have a door to enter the little outbuilding. So on one of the ends, I opened up from the window opening and knew I'd have to make a door for it. Now I like using watercolor pencils to put rust stains where I have nail holes. And I'll just draw a line down the nail hole and then use a brush with water on it, and that spreads the watercolor pencil. And it makes for a nice effect, looking like rust stains. Then I started gluing the windows into the building. Since they were so small, I used a liquid PSA. This way I don't get any glue spreading out. Now I have a how-to on how to use liquid PSA on my channel if you want to catch it. Then I made a minor adjustment to the door frames for the barn doors. I took off the frame off the bottom so it looked like the barn door was a separate piece. Then I ended up using the watercolor pencil. They're also very good at just making frames look dirty. I often use them on both windows and doors. The water spreads the pigment around. Now this is what I used to make the door for the outbuilding. I had a little bit of scribed wood. I cut a piece that was the correct size to fit in there. And then I just used some stripwood to make some bracing that would hold it together and glued the stripwood on. That ended up making a door that I thought was appropriate for an outbuilding on a farm, especially once it was stained. Then my next step was to make floors for the 2 buildings. I usually add floors in most of my kits. Then I went ahead and put the roof onto the little storage bin that was next to the barn. Now I turned to the main roofs for the two buildings. And the barn was going to get a corrugated metal roof. And the outbuilding would get a tar paper roof. So I sprayed both of these with the medium gray primer. Then I started working on the corrugated roofing. I used a variety of rust-colored artist pigments with alcohol as a binder to hold them in place. And then once it had dried, I just cut them into little pieces. And then I'd use 3M 468 adhesive to hold them in place. It's a double-sided adhesive, and after applying it to the roof, then I'd stick the panels onto it in a random fashion, and I'd use a little light rust to touch up the edges. And this is what it would look like after one side was done. Then I did the same on the other side. Then I went ahead and glued the roof onto my barn building. Then after cutting and sanding my tar paper strips, I glued them onto the roof of the shed building. Then I cut and scored a ridge cap to go on the top. And then I used the small strip wood that came in the kit to use as battens to hold down the tar paper. Next I worked on the small overhang that was going to go over the barn doors. I covered it with tar paper and cut a few little supports to hold it in place. Then I checked to make sure how all the buildings were going to go together. I had to cut a little bit of the roof of the outbuilding for it to fit flush up against the barn. And then I had decided to put a couple handles on the lids for the storage bin that went alongside the barn. And I glued them in place. Then I had printed out a couple signs for other stores, and I picked a few that were small enough to work on an N-scale kit. Next I started working on a couple of the details that came with it. There was a propane tank and some lamps and some smokestacks. So I painted the propane tank a green and painted the other pieces a dark gray. Then I glued together my lamps. I painted the underside of them a white. And then I went ahead and put rust on the tops of them. And then while they were drying, I went ahead and used the oil brusher and mineral spirits to put some rust on the propane tank as well. And after all these pieces had dried, I went ahead and glued the lamps onto the barn and the outbuilding. Now I decided I was going to put the smokestack on the outbuilding, and I'd have the propane tank with it. And I cut some flashing out of a thin piece of cardboard, which is what I usually do when I build HO kits. As it turns out, it ended up being too thick for this N-scale, and it kind of stands out. But I went ahead and mounted the smokestack into the outbuilding. Now it was time to use my artist pigments to put some weathering onto the structures. I also ended up using some streaking grime and put that on the propane tank. Now, I have been told by friends that a propane tank this rusty probably would be condemned. But maybe you have condemned tanks on a farm. Then after I was done with that, I went ahead and glued all of the pieces together in the shape that they were going to finally take. Now, since these were going to be used on a portable layout, I glued them together with a nice strong glue, as they'd be picked up a lot. Now, I was pretty happy with how it came out, and it'll serve a nice function on our portable layout. And for an N-scale kit, I'm really surprised in how much detail you can get into this. I'm looking forward to the next few that I'm going to be building as well. And I'd like to thank you very much for watching.